Venezuela sanctions prompted migration warnings to the Trump White House. 3 current and former U.S. government officials cautioned the Trump White House that strong sanctions on Venezuela might accelerate its economic collapse and cause millions of migrants to flee to neighboring countries. People said the Office of Intelligence and Analysis delivered classified assessments to the White House National Security Council and the top 2 DHS officials in at least 4 reports between 2017 and 2019 as part of a larger study of how Venezuela's economic implosion could affect Latin American migration. Nicolas Maduro's regime's human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings, and corruption prompted the Trump administration to impose some of the heaviest economic measures on Venezuela. Proponents argue that the sanctions were justified after one of the worst civilian crackdowns in 20 years. However, Maduro remains in power, and Venezuelan immigration have become a flashpoint in the U.S. presidential election. According to interviews with more than 24 current and former U.S. officials, Trump officials were more concerned about the sanctions' potential effects, including on migration, than previously thought. Venezuelan mass migration to the U.S. began after President Biden took office. "I said the sanctions were going to grind the Venezuelan economy into dust and have huge human consequences, one of which would be outmigration," said Thomas Shannon, President Donald Trump's State Department Undersecretary for Political Affairs. "The sanctions obviously contributed promote speedier outmigration," Shannon said. "And you knew these people would go north eventually. U.S. Sanctions have increased in the previous 2 decades and are in effect in nearly a third of countries." Financial turmoil in Venezuela has split U.S. policymakers. Former Trump aide John Bolton defends the sanctions as a crucial, albeit unsuccessful, attempt to drive Maduro out or limit his financing. Instead of U.S. sanctions, Venezuelans fled Maduro and his predecessor, authoritarian leader Hugo Chavez, who mismanaged the economy. However, other former Trump officials, particularly in the State and Treasury departments, argue U.S. sanctions worsened a bad situation with little benefit. The U.S. restricted Venezuela's oil industry and access to foreign markets, causing its economy to shrink by 71% from 2012 to 2020, the biggest drop in modern history for a non-war country. Since the economic crisis began in 2014, before sanctions, about 7 million Venezuelans have left the nation. In the beginning, migrants moved to Colombia and Peru. Since 2021, federal border agents have encountered over 800,000 Venezuelans coming to the U.S. Even before the sanctions, some federal officials worried about that possibility, but the pandemic and other circumstances have drove Venezuelans to the U.S., and their numbers only increased when Biden assumed office. The Venezuela fallout highlights the challenges of the U.S. money war, which demands officials to balance punishing bad actors abroad with protecting innocent civilians. Last year, the Biden administration temporarily removed crucial sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's assurances to hold a competitive presidential election on Sunday. Because Maduro hasn't kept most of his promises, the Biden administration reimposed sanctions. What are second and third order effects? In 2018, Mauricio Claver Carón saw the Maduro regime's collapse as a chance for the Trump White House. 20 years of mismanagement by Chavez and Maduro and a global oil price drop nearly shattered Venezuela's economy, causing 800% inflation and food and other shortages. Maduro's regime brutally suppressed street protests, jailing and torturing political dissidents. Claver Carón, a top National Security Council staffer, envisaged a potential opposition around Juan Guaidó, the democratically elected National Assembly leader. He envisioned dissatisfaction among military officers, who may build a competing power base. He believed the U.S. must act decisively and aggressively. Obama administration sanctions on Venezuela only targeted Maduro friends and did little to stop the crackdown. Claver Carón and other senior officials believed they could support Guaidó and reverse the nation's humanitarian and political crisis if the Trump administration could use sanctions to sabotage the state-run oil industry, which Maduro used to win military loyalty. Trump, Bolton, a strong number of Capitol Hill congressmen, and the leaders of Venezuela's neighbors, Colombia and Ecuador, supported his approach. According to Claver Carón, U.S. sanctions are more common since they pose less risk to Americans than sending soldiers to Venezuela, which Trump briefly pondered. They could startle a foe that ignores diplomatic advances immediately. Trump banned Venezuelan government and oil corporations from foreign credit markets in 2017. The following 3 years, the administration tightened sanctions on Venezuela's oil exports, the country's lifeline, as the opposition to Maduro grew.